I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today on Inside Wheaton is Dr. Brian Miller. Dr. Miller is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Wheaton College and has the distinction of being one of the few people who has been interviewed on this program before and has returned. So, Brian, it's nice to have you back again.
Thanks for having me.
I'm not sure what that says, if anything, but you're
I hope it means I study interesting things that people need to hear about.
Right, exactly. So thank you for being here again. Last time you were here, we talked about one of your interest areas, which has to do with suburbia. Mm-hmm. And I think we said at that point, we've got to have you back and talk about this other really interesting part of your life, which is looking at social media. Mm-hmm. And being a person on the younger side of the faculty, this fits really well. I mean, a generation ago, it would have been meaningless to talk about that, right?
Right. It's definitely not hard to get students engaged in these conversations in the classroom. If I pull out my smartphone, ask them to do the same, they all have them, they're on them all the time. Every break, they go immediately to the hallway, have to check in. So that's nice. In another sense, though, I kind of stumbled into this topic as a researcher. I have a couple colleagues in graduate school who ended up working on this larger project called the National Study of Youth and Religion, which is this longitudinal study that started with teenagers, so roughly 13 to 16 years old. They followed them now 3 times, and they're going to follow up with a 4th time as they're in their late 20s, sort of tracking their religious growth. But along the way, they ask some of these questions about social media use.
Right.
And it turns out it's actually quite hard to find good data on social media use. There's a few organizations that do it well. Before I came down here, one of them is, I was looking at the Pew Research has an internet project, and they regularly update just sort of basic statistics, how many Americans are using it, what do they do, why do they like it, what don't they like, and so on. But it's hard to find big representative samples, and this study offered a couple thousand emerging adults and some interesting ways to look at social media use.
What do we mean by emerging adults? Is that an age bracket?
Right. So this is a term that arose about 10 years ago now to describe roughly 18 to 30-year-olds.
Okay.
So a period that might have started adulthood, say 3, 4, 5 decades ago, but now is this college, but then sort of extended. They're living at home more often. They're switching careers more often. They're not settled in. They're marrying at later ages.
Now, one of the things, before we get into some of these faith, how faith integrates with social media, one of the things it seems like to me, Brian, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that some of us who are a little older tend to think, well, social media is for the youngsters. That's not true anymore, is it? I mean, people my age are using social media.
Right. And that has happened quite a lot in the last 5 years. When you look at stories of companies like Facebook starts in a college dorm room, that was their original audience, but now it's grown quite a bit. If you look at the data, though, still today, some of the biggest differences between internet users and social media users are age. So it drops off a decent amount once you get past 50 and 60, and then also income levels. People of higher income have more access to the internet, can afford smartphones, so on.
So you've written an article in the Sociology of Religion, and let's talk about that a little bit. Give us a title, because some people are going to want to go find this, and I'm sure if they can find that online and so forth. But the article has to do with social media and religious practice, right?
Right. The title is Faith in the Age of Facebook, Exploring the Links Between Religion and Social Network Site Membership and Use.
Well, it's long enough to be a dissertation.
All academic papers, right?
Exactly.
Now, we got into this because there's a table in the book Souls in Transition that came out of this National Study of Youth and Religion, sort of buried towards the end of the book, that notes that emerging adults who are more religious, so they attend church more, they report higher personal levels of faith, they read their Bible more, tend to use social network sites less. And to us as grad students at the time, we thought, what would be behind that? Right? What exactly would lead directly from religiosity to less Facebook use? I ask my students, how many of you have actually heard sermons about Facebook use? None, right? It's not a common topic that's talked about in the pulpit. They don't get direct instruction, but there was this clear link. So in this paper, we look at some different mechanisms by which religion might affect that. Maybe it's different religious groups. So we look at conservative Protestants versus Catholics versus mainline Protestants versus Black Protestants, Jews, others. Not much of a difference there. You can look at some measures of personal practice, like how many times do they pray? How many times do they read their Bible? Some of those matter. In fact, the most consistent finding we found in the paper, more Bible reading leads to less social network site use.
Yeah.
But there we don't have the data that would tell us why that is. Is it because they're reading their Bible so many hours a day they just don't have time? Maybe unlikely, but we don't have some of those measures. So that's a little bit unclear. Some of the other things that matter are things like being in school. That makes sense. So college students have more access to computers. They have some more free time compared to emerging adults who are working, and so on. But that Bible reading matters. That was the big finding we had.
Do these, and I know it's often risky to ask a person like a sociologist when you're doing statistical things, but I always like to ask the cause and effect. So I know you're measuring statistics, numbers of hours. Can we get at any cause and effect? Like why? You alluded to that a minute ago.
Right. To do that, you have to have the data that could answer some of those. What are some of those mechanisms? So if you think about sociology is often a discipline that says this is related to that. X leads to Y, X causes Y. But in the last 10 or 20 years, we've noticed that there's even an important question after that stage of asking, well, why does X cause Y? Like, how do you get from this to that? Not just that they're related, but how are they related?
Right. A lot of people will cite things like Marshall McLuhan and those who come after him, Neil Postman and so forth, and sort of try to make a case for it's the old form and function, or the medium is the message, right?
Right.
Talk to me about that. So especially from a Christian standpoint, somebody who claims to be a Christian who has this religious component, are they perhaps wary of social media because of that? Are they saying, regardless, this is just not a good form for the communication of my faith? Or
that could be. I think evangelicals might struggle with that a little bit because we have been a religious group that's been known for being quite innovative. If the culture's doing it, we adapt it however we can.
True.
So you go into the early days of radio, the early days of television. Evangelicals are there early on saying, maybe we're not concerned whether this is good for people, but let's just use it, right? If we know they're watching, we know they're participating, let's do that. I've gotten into some conversations with other academics who wanted to know if we had found anything about religious websites or religious Facebook portals, where you can find daily Bible readings and so on. Hard to know. There are what's going on there. There is some other research that suggests faith is not displayed all that prominently on sites like Facebook. It used to be one of those things that was a key marker of your profile. They'd ask you what your religious beliefs are. It doesn't really show up anymore. It's not on that main page. You can find it, but it's a generational thing. The millennials don't necessarily lead with that information of, this is my main identity.
Right.
My point of view as a sociologist would be anytime you get a new technology like this, is that we should at least ask some questions about what is this doing to us. I'm not opposed to social media. I participate in them. I'm on Facebook. I blog regularly. Not on Twitter or LinkedIn or some of those others, though I'd like to be. Haven't gotten there yet. Don't have the time yet to get there. I think there's some good sides to it and there's some bad sides, but at least we need to ask some of those questions. From a global perspective, we're known as a country that likes technology.
Yeah.
Americans like progress. We like when people invent things, and we don't tend to ask some of those questions until later.
Right.
And maybe 10, 20 years down the road, and we think, well, maybe that wasn't the best. And then at that point, it's a little hard to pull back.
What do you say to your students, Brian? And this may not be maybe this is informally because maybe it doesn't form your class so much, but what do you say to students in terms of advice as a Christian young person, considering how to balance the use of all the social media?
My general answer would be, like a lot of good things in life, it's best used in moderation. You might think of a litmus test you could use to know whether you are using it well or not. Think about if you were going on vacation for 3, 4, 5 days. Could you survive without your smartphone or the internet for those 3, 4, 5 days? There are a lot of people in our world now who have a really hard time doing that. There's some studies in the last few years that even measure physical withdrawal symptoms that teenagers have when their smartphone's not there. So if that's the issue, that may suggest you're a little too tied to it. But that would be the same for television. That'd be the same for food. That'd be the same for lots of good things.
I borrowed my son's smartphone yesterday for a minute, and I saw him again, and I said, "Do you need this back?" And he said, "Not really, but I'll take it. I feel naked without it.
Right.
That's exactly what you're saying.
Right. It's one of those things you wake up in the morning, you have to have it. Some other studies that show the average person is never more than 3 or 4 feet away from their smartphone ever, right? It's right next to your bed. It's your alarm clock. It's your media source. You're checking the weather. It's your connection to your friends and family. It's pretty crucial these days.
I'd like to talk for a minute, Brian, about what seems to me to be front and center. And you and I talked about this before we started this interview a little bit. There seems to me to be an increasing ability of people who even would call themselves Christians and would identify as a Christian to be very, very in your face on social media. I believe in a way that they would never do to your face. Talk about that a little bit. What's at work there? And is that a dangerous thing?
There's something different that goes on in a face-to-face conversation than does through these technologies. I think that's part of it. When you're sitting like we are right here, a couple feet away from each other, I'm worried about how you're going to react to me. I'm looking for your nonverbal cues. Right. That sort of information just doesn't exist online. It's more of a vacuum. In one way, that's one of the big advantages of social media is it allows a user to use it however they would like. So I can choose when I'm going to communicate with people, how I communicate with people, and who I communicate with. Those sort of choices aren't available to you in normal life. That's a bad term to use, not normal life. Offline life.
Offline life, right.
You have to interact with people who cross your path. There may be people at your work or in your classroom or in your dorm or in your family that you just don't want to interact with at times, and you don't have that choice in the same way you do in this mediated world. It's more in the individual's control, and there's certainly people who take advantage of that and let some of the things out that they wouldn't in more social settings.
What would you say then, looking ahead, and one can only imagine this is going to increase. I mean, I don't see this going away. What would you say from a Christian vantage point is the best way to think about using that then? Because we're called not only to present truth, but we're called to love each other, frankly. Right. And so talk about some ways we might think through that.
Right. So some of the advantages you could use social media for are things like expanding your social network. So things like, that classmate who moved away in 3rd grade and you never saw again, you can reconnect with. Or a family member who happens to be halfway around the world on a business trip you can talk to. That's a good thing. In fact, sociologists would say there's a lot of value in what we would call weak ties. Sort of people who aren't in your immediate circle, but that's where a lot of your information comes from. If you really want a job, for example, you don't go to the people you know directly because they know a lot of the same information you do. You go to their friends and their friends of friends who know a lot more and have wider influence. The problem with some of that is then we may have these wider networks, but we may have shallower individual connections with people. How much time can you really spend with those hundreds of Facebook friends? There's an academic who suggests that humans can handle about 150 close relationships in life. Once you get above that number, there's just not enough time and effort to put into them. I think online and these social media technologies, you can present yourselves as you want. Right? You can sculpt the profile, you can be witty, you can do the things you want to do. Sometimes people call that being fake or inauthentic. I don't think so. When you ask users, they don't describe it that way. It's just another form of what we do in face-to-face conversation, of impression management. You're trying to put your best face forward or what you think people will like. Is it the whole person? No. But it's a part of them. And maybe you can dig below the surface there and see who they really are.
I'm thinking of those posts on Facebook, for example, that I think are, a little blatant. Maybe it's a political view or something like that. It seems to me, and I found myself falling into this trap, and often I succumb. It just gets my blood boiling so much that I sit at the keyboard and I type out a response. And the other day it struck me, you don't have to do that. And I stopped. I didn't post the response that I thought I could have. And I thought, you know what, that was the wiser thing to do, because really what is it going to accomplish to shoot back, even if I feel strongly about that topic? And my point is maybe we need to develop ways of thinking through that, because it's so easy to hit a key and respond right now, isn't it?
Right. What you see in a lot of these technologies is just a lot of people talking past each other. not necessarily even being mad, but it's a medium that lends itself. You don't have to have any give and take because they're not in front of you. You don't have to come to an agreement. You can just choose to end the conversation at some point if you want. And that's different, right? There's also research that shows people tend to visit websites that agree with them. You can end up in your little echo chambers.
Right.
And that's another issue. I know political scientists talk about this, how this will influence democracy if everyone's sort of talking to people like them, lack of communication across the political aisle, not seeing ideas different than yourselves. In theory, the internet and social media offers amazing potential. The amount of information that's at people's fingertips today is just astounding, right? A student can pull out a smartphone and access thousands of books, tons of information, and so on. Well, one question is, are they really using it for that? No, usually not, and I don't either. But even if you do have all that information, how do you know how to sort through it? What do you do with it?
Right. It's overload.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem 3, 4, 5 decades ago was it just took a long time to even gather information. You see this in things like the number of citations that academics have in their articles. 3, 4 decades ago, you could only get your hands on maybe 20, 30, 40 articles. Today, you're regularly citing 70, 80, 90, 100 because they're easy to find in these databases. You see them all the time. They're accessible. Does it make scholarship better? Maybe. Right? You've got a wider view. Or we could think of a study show of adults and teenagers today. They consume about 11 hours of media a day. Again, there's great potential in some of that, but what does that mean in the long run? What are you taking in? How does that influence you? That's hard to sort out.
Yeah. I want to talk in these last couple of minutes, Brian, about something you're working on now, which has to do with, you told me this phrase and it kind of intrigued me, informal rules. This is what? How people are using the social media?
Right. So if you go to a social media site like Facebook, they are fairly hands-off in how you can interact with other people. There's some clear violations. There's things like you can only friend a certain number of people at a time before they think you're spamming other people and you're trying to market something. But we found in some interviews with these emerging adults, 18 to 23-year-olds a few years ago, that they tend to follow these informal rules that Facebook didn't set up. It's not that adults were telling them these things. They just sort of learned from each other and from some of their experiences about how you go about interacting with people. So we found there were sort of 3 informal rules. 1, you don't share too much information about yourself, so you limit that. And if you do share that information, you make sure it's limited to a very private circle. You don't want that information to get out. 2, you don't spy on or stalk other users. So there's a limit to how much you can interact with others. And 3, people tend to be friends online with people they already know. So it's unlike some of these media reports that suggest teenagers are talking to all sorts of crazy people and making weird friends. Most people tend to stick to people they already know offline. It's another way to make a connection with them, to enhance that relationship.
It almost sounds like there's a built-in protocol in us as humans, sociologically, that extends to, I mean, we're not going to go off and do those things even though we have the technology to do them. Is that?
That could be. It could also be that we're still trying to figure out what this technology is all about. So when you're talking to college students today, or some of us who are a little older than that, we can remember a world where this technology didn't exist. I was in middle school and high school when AOL was big. So I remember, going into some of these chat rooms and making friends, and this was a whole new world. The question will be with newer generations, younger future students and so on, a term that's been applied to them, digital natives. What are they going to see as normal? It could be quite different. All this might be what they know from a very young age. I mean, 3, 4, 5, 6, they have tablets and smartphones and they're interacting with people. They may not have some of these reluctant feelings that we do at times.
The barriers that we have,
To them, it's normal.
Yeah. Dr. Brian Miller is Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Wheaton College. By the way, if you're looking for that article, it's in the journal Sociology of Religion. Give us the title one more time.
Faith in the Age of Facebook.
All right. Faith in the Age of Facebook in the journal Sociology of Religion. And if you'd like to know more about sociology here at the college, just visit wheaton.edu. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheaton.